Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yang Yixiao. My student ID is A0328130R. Today, I will be presenting my project entitled From Universal Sensitivity to Native Sound Categories: How Infants Acquire the Phonetic Repertoire of Their Language. It asks a simple but profound question. How do infants, within just their first year of life, move from being able to hear every speech sound in the world to focusing only on those that belong to their native language? Here is an overview of what I will cover today. First, I will outline the background, the developmental puzzle, and introduce several core mechanisms to drive the transition. And then I will present 4 recent empirical studies published between 2021 and 2024, each highlighting a different piece of the puzzle. After that, I will discuss the comparative summary table that brings the finding together. Finally, I will integrate the empirical and theoretical insights and conclude with broader implications and future directions. So let's start with the background. Newborns are often described as universal listeners. They can discriminate speech sound contrast from almost any language, like Hindi, Zulu, Japanese, English, you name it. But between 6 and 12 months, their perceptual space begins to narrow. By their first birthday, they are typically specialized for the phoneme of the native language, and they often lose sensitivity to non-native contrasts. This developmental shift raises the key question: what mechanisms enable infants to recognize their perceptual system too efficiently? Is it the statistical properties of the input, the social context of learning, and the maturation of neural circuits, all of the above? 4 mechanisms have been identified as major contributors. The distributional learning. Infants detect the frequency and distribution of acoustic cues in speech. In Maya et al. 2002, infants exposed to a bimodal distribution of sound learned 2 categories, whereas those hearing a unimodal distribution did not. Perceptual narrowing. Over time, infants' auditory system becomes neuronally committed to native language contrast, shown by Call et al. 2008. Infant-directed speech caregivers use slower tempo, higher pitch, and exaggerated vowels. Marklund 2021 found that this hyperarticulation actually correlates with infants' vocal complexity. Bilingual exposure. Final McDonald showed that bilingual infants maintain broader tolerance for phonetic variation, possibly preserving plasticity for longer. Together, these mechanisms create a developmental trajectory from universal sensitivity to native specialization. Now let's focus on 4 studies. Study 1, Fennell and McDonald, 2024. The first study I will discuss directly examine distributional learning and bilingual flexibility. Participants are 48 infants aged 6 to 8 months, half monolingual and half bilingual. Exposed to either bimodal or trimodal distributions of synthetic syllables. Discrimination measured via head turn or looking time procedures. The main finding of this study is infants in the bimodal condition performed significantly better than those in unimodal exposure, confirming that statistical peaks help carve category boundaries. Interestingly, bilingual infants were more flexible, suggesting their experience with verbal input enhances generalization. And one noticed because the stimuli were artificial, the ecological fidelity is limited. The real speech environment may involve far more complex acoustic variability. The study 2. The second study asks whether such distributional cues exist in natural caregiver speech. The method is a large corpus analysis of English infant-directed speech. The approach is acoustic modeling of vowel space using F1, F2 formants. The finding of the study 2 is even in natural input, vowels cluster statistically, meaning infants could in principle learn categories just from listening. This finding strengthens the ecological case for distributional learning. However, the study relied on a computational model rather than direct behavior data from infants, so it shows potential, not proof of learning. Let's focus on study 3. The third study shifted focus from statistics to social interaction. Participants of this study's 50 parent-infant deaths, infants around 12 months old. The measure is parents' vowel hyperarticulation and infants' phonetic complexity in babbling. There is a moderate positive correlation. R is 0.45, P is lower than 0.01, meaning infants whose parents exaggerated vowel more produced more complex vocalizations. The VHI and infant's complexity is here. This suggests that socially tuned speech might score for infants' own phonetic development. The limitation of the study is correlational. We can't tell whether hyperarticulation causes greater complexity or if parents naturally adapt their speech to more advanced infants. Let's focus on study 4. Zhao and colleagues connect neural processing in infancy to later language outcomes. EEG, ERP recordings of infants aged 6 to 12 months responding to speech sound contrasts. The same children were tested for vocabulary and reading skills at age 6. Finding in infants with stronger mismatch responses later showed better vocabulary and reading performance. This longitudinal evidence implies that early neural sensitivity to phonetic distinctions sets the stage for subsequent language growth. But note that the sample was small, around 35 follow-ups, so replication is important. Let's focus on comparative and critical discussion. This is the comparative summary table, which synthesized the 4 studies. According to the table, we can see complementary rather than contradiction. Each study captures a distinct level of analysis: behavior, acoustic, social, and neutral, together forming a developmental continuum. Let's briefly summarize the broader strengths and limitations emerging from the body of the research. The strengths: 1. Multi-method evidence, combining behavior experiment, corpus analysis, acoustic studies, and neuropsychological data provided a triangulated perspective. For developmental continuity, the findings collectively link early perception with later language outcomes, bridging micro-level learning and macro-level development. For theoretical integration, each study arranges with and extend key theoretical models, such as distributional learning and neutral commitment, illustrating how empirical results contribute to an unfilled developmental framework. For limitations, population bias is most participants are monolingual Western infants, a problem for cross-linguistic generalization, and methodological fragmentation. Different studies use different metrics and stimuli, which makes meta-analytics challenging. And short-term focus, only Zhao take the longitudinal approach, so we still know little about how early phonetic sensitivity unfolds into grammar or literacy later on. Okay, now let's focus on the integration, empirical and theoretical insight. When we put these pieces together, a developmental continuum emerged. Statistical learning initiates category formation. Ecological input in caregiver speech provide real distributional cues. Social feedback from interaction fine-tune phonetic production. And the fourth, neural commitment consolidate categories and predict language outcomes. Worker at that while this perceptual reorganization is universal, its timing differs across languages, depending on input density and constructive structure. Meanwhile, Crystal and Sido argues that input variability, such as exposure to multiple speakers or accent, actually stabilized category learning rather than confusing infants. Together, these theoretical perspectives extend and reinforce the empirical evidence. So, what does all this tell us? Phonetic acquisition is multi-layered. It is not driven by any single factor, but by the interaction of three factors: statistical inference, enabling infants to detect patterns in the input, and social interaction, which amplifies and contextualizes those patterns, and neural adaptation, which consolidate the learned categories over time. These findings support an experience-dependent plasticity view of language development. The brain shapes itself through exposure and engagement. However, several gaps remain. The field needs cross-linguistic and bilingual studies to test universality. We also need integrated behavior neural plagiarisms to capture both learning and processing in real time. Finally, more longitudinal designs can reveal how early phonetic sensitivity affects later morphosyntax or literacy skills. To conclude, infant sound acquisition is not a single mechanism. It's a collaborative process of statistical inference, social action, and neural adaptation. Together, these mechanisms sculpt the phonetic repertoire that makes language possible. And this page includes all of the reference this presentation used. Well, thanks for your listening.